Hey all, my friend is here with me today, and we are going to be talking about the representation of sexual violence and assault against males in media and its impacts. Before we continue, we want to issue a trigger warning. We will be openly talking about sexual violence and sexual assault, and we just want to make sure that you're aware before you continue watching. So, one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this topic is because last year, when I watched Superman, the new Superman movie that came out, I was really upset about the Jimmy Olsen storyline. In fact, I was generally like enjoying the movie, and then the Jimmy Olsen storyline happened, and I was really upset about it. One of the main, nobody was talking about it online. I still have yet to come across anyone talking about it online. But one of the things that people were talking about was comparing the two Superman movies, this one from 2025 and the original, I believe was 1978 one with Christopher Reeves, and like which Superman movie was better and which Superman was better. So I was like, okay, let me go back and watch the Superman movie from the 70s because I haven't seen it since I was a kid. And sure enough, I got to that scene where that same character, Eva Teschmacher, sexually assaults Superman. He is incapacitated. There is like this necklace of kryptonite around him, and he's kind of drowning in this pool, and he asks for her help, and she comes down to help him. And before she removes the necklace, she kisses him, and then she removes the necklace, and he even asks her, "Why did you kiss me?" And she was like, "Because you wouldn't have let me if I had taken it off." And then he just thanks her, and she asks him why she can't get the good guys, and he caresses her face and he flies off. I was again so upset. Like, okay, so I'm like, "Ugh, the 2025 movie has a storyline like that. Then in this movie, there's an actual sexual assault that happens, and no one in all of their discussions about the two movies is talking about either of these, like that moment or that storyline. And I was so pissed off. Like it deeply disturbed me, and it like really ruined both movies for me. And I think one of the things that like really got to me was the fact that, parents and especially a lot of fathers like excitedly took their sons to watch that movie, the 2025 movie, and some of them I think were even like showing the old one to their sons too. And so it's like again, it's like these little boys are being exposed to these seemingly innocuous moments and storylines in these shows and movies.
And one of the things that really strikes me with this is the fact that, the parents probably didn't pick up on it, because this type of thing is so normalized. And the way the movie framed it, the 2025 movie certainly framed it as comedic, even. And in fact, Jimmy Olsen was the one seen as being, this womanizing jerk who, was just constantly turning down this woman who kept making unwanted advances at him. And then suddenly, he realizes that, oh, I was in love with her all along. You know, I think in this day and age, if the genders were reversed, even if not everybody, certainly more people as compared to, how many there were in the audience, which is to say none, would probably have spoken up a bit and said that, hang on, this is really wrong, you know? So I think the fact that this is so normalized, and as we all know at this point, Hollywood, both historically and today, has a very checkered history when it comes to how they present sexual assault. And even with women, this awareness is relatively recent, where, for decades you did have men kissing women without their consent, grabbing at them, you know, it was considered the manly thing to do to just take what you wanted. That's how men were supposed to be. And a woman saying no was seen as her being hard to get. Like she didn't really mean it, and that sent a very toxic message. However, in the past decade or so, more conversations have been had and there's more awareness to the point where now people recognize it a bit more as they should. What's concerning is that the same cannot clearly be said for sexual violence against men and boys, as certainly Superman 2025 represents, because even if you could have made the argument about the 1970s Superman where Okay, at that time, conversations about sexual assault against women were also not being had. So that was very much a product of its time. That's just how people were. We do know better now, at least in some regard. So we
Yeah,
do know.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that was kind of why I was like, wait, no one is talking about this? Like, absolutely no one is talking about either the Jimmy Olsen storyline or in all the rewatching of Superman. No one was talking about, oh, this scene happened. And so, yeah, it's just like, is it ever going to be addressed? I think is a question.
And, when we talk about parents bringing children to see movies like this, what's really important to remember here is the concept of priming theory. So, priming theory is a theoretical framework that examines how people react to situations based on previous experiences, misconceptions they may have, or any preconceptions they may have as a result of their background, all of those things. It's very commonly used in psychology and in media and communication. So, in the case of media specifically, priming theory examines how we, as audience members, are primed to accept information or depictions that we see over time and take those as factual, and not really question it because we're not shown anything different, which is actually where the concept of representation comes in. So, for example, let's say that if all we are seeing in the media that we consume is a certain group of people that is different from what we are used to, are constantly depicted as villains, they are depicted as terrorists, they're depicted as evil. It's not really surprising then that these people that we're only ever seeing depicted on screen and we don't necessarily have any interaction with them prior to seeing that, we internalize it and we, naturally begin to see the real life people like that. And in fact, priming is very often intentional. So, with that in mind, how we view sexual assault is also intentional. Certainly, going back to the subject of women and girls being assaulted, of course that was intentional because society didn't really recognize sexual assault for what it was. And quite frankly, a lot of the times they even promoted it, you know. So, and the same thing with men and boys, where, again, these kids are going in and the depictions that they're seeing are depicting as comedic, as funny. They're even seeing, the man that's, being assaulted by the woman eventually fall in love, which, negates the assault that came before it, at least, in terms of the depiction. And they're internalizing that. And they don't really have anybody to call that out. So what's the message that they're taking home with them?
Right. Yeah. And sometimes the depiction is like the character who's assaulted is lauded for it, like praised, like, oh, that happened to you. That's great. And that's also something that young boys take with them.
And this is something that happens specifically with boys, where, this idea of losing your virginity to an older woman, you know, of course you're going to love that. And a lot of the times, men who are actually assaulted don't even realize that it's assault because again, why would they? They're being lauded for it. They're supposed to want it, even if in that moment they actually didn't want it. So, again, priming, and it's extremely subtle. And the whole idea is that we don't realize it's happening.
And there's that notion of like, uh, men cannot be raped. And what people are essentially saying is that men do not have boundaries that can be violated.
Yeah. And again, it comes down to how it's portrayed. Like, are we portraying it as something serious that needs to be talked about? And we as a society are very good at filtering out the things that are uncomfortable. And I think that goes into the reason it's uncomfortable is because we're not trained to talk about it.
And that goes into the emotional immaturity, right? Because emotional immaturity is all about not wanting to engage with uncomfortable feelings, right? And that's the same thing of like we are taught that, these types of things are uncomfortable and we don't want to try to process them and handle them and deal with them as a society. And it's all steeped in emotional immaturity and I would say enabling very much is based in emotional immaturity and, wanting to silence and minimize the trauma of victims while maintaining the status quo and the abuse, and many times propping up the abuser themselves.
Yes, and I think going into that, one thing that is important to recognize is that we live in a culture on a global level. We live in a culture that is deeply anti victim and pro abuser. And that goes beyond just the subject that we're talking about today. That's steeped in everything in so many different levels where actually abusive behavior is not only normalized, but even rewarded. Whereas the behavior that is depicted by victims is punished, it's pushed aside.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And again, with the enabling, right? A big thing is like the victim is blamed before the abuser is even questioned, or like there's no accountability. It's always, why did you put yourself in that situation? Right. And with men, it's not even recognized as a situation. It's just like, oh, good on you. That happened to you. Or they're just laughed at. And it's so detrimental. So some of the earliest commentary, I think that really did a good job of, talking about this topic was Pop Culture Detective's videos back like 6, 7 years ago, where he has two different videos, one for male perpetrators of male sexual assault and one for female perpetrators, and how it's always played for laughs. And in the video about female perpetrators, he has this great line that I think goes really well with what you've been talking about in terms of priming theory. So he says, this is so ingrained in our culture that even as you watch some of the clips in this video, you may catch yourself questioning whether or not some of the examples are really that bad, or if they really amount to sexual harassment or sexual assault. And if those questions pop into your mind, I just ask you to keep in mind that all these punchlines are built around non consensual interactions. So I really think this line like does a really great job of summarizing what you're talking about in terms of, how we are, for so long, Hollywood has been showing us these images and these storylines and wanting us to find them funny and to, really want us to look at this as this is just the way it is, right? That's a very enabling way to think about it. But that's why I, bring up enabling, because that's a very enabling mentality of like, this is just the way it is. And so, going back to what I said earlier about the Jimmy Olsen storyline in the Superman 2025 and why that really upset me was because two of the things that I remember from Pop Culture Detectives videos were actually in that storyline. And one of the things was that sexual extortion is one version of how men are sexually assaulted by women. And she sexually extorts Jimmy with the pictures, because she says she'll only send him the pictures that she has, like the proof, if he spends the weekend with her. And he didn't want to. And like you said, it's always depicted as funny. And that, Pop Culture Detectives video was about how it's depicted as funny. So definitely, like, you could pick up Jimmy Olsen's storyline and drop it into Pop Culture Detectives video from like 6 years ago. That's how much it fit. So that was one thing. And then another thing that Pop Culture Detective said was that a lot of time the perpetrator, the female perpetrator, is unattractive. And when he talks to Lois on the phone about the pictures, Lois says something like, your hot ex is a genius. And he's like, hot, like, because he didn't ever view Eva as hot. And at the end, then, when they reunite and she hugs him and she's like, now we could be together forever or something like that. And he first stiffens and then relaxes and smiles. And at the end, she's like, there's another like moment shown and she's just clinging off of him. And it's just so gross if you think about like the entire storyline. Like, ugh, it was like an ick factor.
Yeah, and not only is it portrayed as comedy, like there's even moments where, for example, like with this extortion scene, where she's basically blackmailing him into spending a weekend. She has just been assaulted prior to this, but and in the way that she's depicted, her hair is a mess. She's crying when she does it. So you're put in the position of feeling sorry for her, where she's just put her life at risk, and you can't even do this much for her, where it's like, no, but what she's actually asking is that you know somebody spend the weekend with her against his will. That's not, no matter what happened before that, like that's just not good. Like there were plenty of other ways you could have done that. So again, that's you're put in a position of where you're empathizing with the person who's displaying sexually coercive behavior as opposed to the person who's on the receiving end of it. And it's interesting because we've talked about like the fact that parents are bringing kids to this movie without any awareness to what they're showing their kids. And we've talked about how this primes kids. Certainly when I think back to my first experience of seeing sexual assault depicted on the screen, and honestly, I didn't realize it was sexual assault. I was very young. I was a young teenager at the time. I did not realize that what I was seeing was sexual assault, was through the character of Sam Winchester on Supernatural. And it's wild when I look back because this was actually in the pilot episode where you have this mythical creature, the woman in white, who's known for standing on roadsides and trapping men. That's what happens with them while they're hunting her. And there's a scene where she's putting her hands onto him. And it is clearly meant to be very sexually charged, and he's resisting. So what we're seeing is sexual assault depicted. As an adult, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that they had this, in particular with the character of Sam, who is positioned as the nerdy one, the more effeminate one, even though physically he's actually probably the more imposing of the brothers, because the actor is way taller, way broader, but actually that also leads into it, this tall, imposing man who's super quote unquote effeminate, and nerdy, it's like, ha ha, look, but then
Oh,
for
in the commentary, they wished I can't remember, it was Eric Kripke and someone else, and I can't remember who that was. They wished they were in Sam's place. I distinctly remember that I watched that interview like when the pilot came out. And yeah, it was a very Eric Kripke video. And that mentality, you hear that too with a lot of like showrunners and a lot of commentary online when male sexual assault is depicted. A lot of men, especially, will be like, "Oh, I wish that was me." And Eric Kripke and whoever was doing the interview with him, they both said something along those lines. Like, I still remember that. And I watched that interview maybe once and that was it. But that stayed with me.
And what's interesting is again, this ties back into Prime because these men, we have to remember these men are still human beings and they're saying it for a reason because that's how they've been taught to think. So when they say, "Oh, I wish that were me," first of all, no, they don't. If they were actually in that situation and in like a very scary situation where nobody wants to be victimized. However, when you're seeing it on screen and it's more of an abstract context, yeah, like and because of the way they've been primed to think like this is a good thing, actually, they're going to say stuff like that. And again, this is why men who are sexually assaulted or raped, abused, they don't recognize it, particularly when for example, the woman in white, even in mythology and certainly within the show, it was depicted as this beautiful woman, you know. So there is this element where, again, in a very abstract way, because of the way they've been conditioned, and but the issue is that that conditioning is then passed on to the children that are watching. And Supernatural, certainly at the time had a very young audience. I was around the age that their core demographic was. And again, like it's only later looking back that I realized just how messed up it was.
Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah, let's talk about that now. Like, what about accountability, right? Because at the end of the day, it's kind of like we know when we talk about generational trauma, right? This is a generational cycle to normalize sexual assault, especially of males. With women, like that has been becoming addressed more and more. But what about accountability, like growth? And even though you are primed to, view it in a certain way, at one point you have to make a decision on your own whether you want to continue to view something like this as good or not. Because that's where, generational cycle breaking comes from, where you're accountable at the end of the day for how you view and interact with other people.
And like speaking of accountability, I do think, and we'll get into it a little bit later as well, but with Supernatural specifically, Eric Kripke, this is, this is he has a track record for this. Supernatural, this was like, the first documented example that I can think of, but certainly, this is something scary. Also, even if, let's say, circa 2005, because in that era it just wasn't talked about, he would have thought that, and again, Eric Kripke was a fully grown adult man at that time anyway. However, let's say circa 2005, it truly hadn't entered his consciousness because it hadn't entered public consciousness. Over a decade later, that man's mentality clearly still has not changed, and we will talk about it a little bit later, but I do want, this to be said that, like you said, accountability matters, especially when you have a platform of a television show which is being watched by what was at the time teenagers and young people. We talk about the pilot episode, this was something that carried on, and especially with the character of Sam, this sort of thing of where he was sexually assaulted and there was some sort of sexually inappropriate joke. There was one particular episode in season 4 or season 5 where there Sam is fielding these inappropriate advances. It's depicted as something funny where he is visibly uncomfortable and she is groping him on screen, and we apparently are meant to find this funny, and they even have Dean making fun of him for it on screen. And, there's another episode in, I believe, season 4 where they are in prison hunting a monster. And there are several jokes made at Sam's expense, about, prison rape, where, there's references made to, what he might have to do for protection and things like that, which again, there's this added layer of how we talk about prison in society and how prison is depicted, particularly men's prisons. So that's, what tends to be depicted the most.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And when you think about the prevalence of prison rape jokes is just like that is definitely one of the ones that you see in so many different places. Like even right now, I'm thinking about it. There's that one joke in one of the Iron Man movies. I think it was the second one where he goes to see the guy. Can't remember the character's name. The one who had the electric wires. Right, he was the one who was taking revenge on Tony Stark, and he got arrested. And Tony went to see him, and Tony makes a joke like, "I'll send you a bar of soap." That very common joke that is very prevalent. And if you think about like the context of who the jokes targets, right? We think about the US, we think about the what I call the injustice system and the incarceration of like so many, especially POCs. Like it's very much a socioeconomic, like very socioeconomic in terms of like who has higher incarceration rates. It's mostly POCs, blacks, Latinos primarily. And even for whites, like you have the poor white go to the jail, not rich whites. And if they do, they go to some fancy jail. And so the people who these jokes are made about many times are innocent people or people who have been given like exorbitant sentences. And they are also the targets of prison rape jokes. We are meant to accept the horrors that they experience while they are incarcerated. And you have to like wonder about the class divide and the social divide between who is making these jokes, like Hollywood, people in Hollywood who, again, that history of, these are like rich white men running studios, right? These are primarily white showrunners and filmmakers who insert these jokes and normalize the rape of men in prison. And who are the ones in prison? Primarily POCs and not. And if you think of the history of the US in terms of like slavery, and slavery itself was imprisonment, like the historical context of prison rape jokes is so like disturbing.
And certainly with prison rape jokes as well, there's added elements of, queerness where, this idea that somehow, because, men are going to go into men's prisons with other men, and this adds the element of fear and this, stigmatization. But also, when it comes to prison rape, because again, speaking of a show like Supernatural, or your reference to Iron Man, it's the fact that they're depicted as villains, and it's a hero that's making that joke. So what does that prime us to think, you know? And also, you know, I do think no matter what else, we can talk about the stats, we can talk about the disproportionate prison sentences and all that, but even I would argue that even in a context where the person they deserve some sort of repercussion, legal repercussion. This idea that just because they are incarcerated, they could be guilty of the crime, but that does not mean that they deserve to be raped. They deserve to be sexually assaulted. That is something that's just should be off the table. Like, being guilty of some sort of crime should not, come with the caveat of, oh, well, you did this crime, therefore. Like, that should not be a thing. But in our society, it is. Like, we normalize this.
Yeah. And you like it's one of those things where it's like, why sink to that level? Like, why, if we believe we are better than criminals, or even if it was a serial rapist, let's say, if you believe that you are better than them, why why even sink to the level of thinking, oh, they deserve to be raped? Because at the end of the day, it's still the normalization of the act, right? And it's the normalization of that act that as a society we need to combat. We need to develop respect for human boundaries and be against the violation of any human being, no matter what.
And especially to your example of, let's say it is a serial rapist. Okay, just for the sake of argument, we say that to a serial rapist. Well, what about all the other people that aren't serial rapists? Because they're going to get it too. So it's like, it's not about the person at the end of the day. It's about the act, and it's about what you, as a person who's using that as a joke, is saying. At that point, it's a reflection on you as opposed to who you're saying it to.
My first, one of the first depictions of like prison rape that I watched was, it was like, I don't know, back then when I was a teen living in Pakistan, and I watched the movie Sleeper. So this was a movie about four boys. They had been playing, they'd been like joking around. I think they pushed this like hot dog cart down a set of stairs, and at the bottom they didn't know there was like this old man, and he died. And so they were put into juvie, and the prison guards who very regularly they raped the boys, they sexually assaulted the boys. And so the way the story actually starts out, and I'm like totally spoiling it for anyone who hasn't seen it, I would say it is a triggering movie. And I, like I said, I was a teen when I watched it, and it stuck with me. And these two, what happens is like when they're older, two of them are at a restaurant and they see him and they kill him. And so one of the boys, so there were four of them, one of them is a district attorney and he gets the case. And another one is a journalist, I believe, and he's telling their story. I can't remember exactly the details. I would probably never watch this movie again because it would deeply upset me. Like I said, years later, I still remember it. I would say it's one of the few honest depictions that has come out of Hollywood of the impacts of prison rape, especially on boys who go to juvie.
And something to remember when we talk about these prison jokes and things is that people who are incarcerated are some of the most vulnerable in our society, regardless of whether they're guilty of the crime. You know, they are vulnerable the moment they get into that prison. They are at the mercy of the prison system. And so, the prison system is inherently abusive. So again, regardless of whether the person's guilty or not, these types of jokes made by people who are not in that situation, and quite frankly are very often coming from a place of privilege anyway. And so it's like again, like you said, why stoop to that level? Why you know why say something like that is just, it's cruel, it's gross, and it's dehumanizing.
Prison rape jokes are a way to teach people to not have empathy for prisoners. Like that's like, a big goal of it. When you talk about priming theory, it's a big goal of it is to take pleasure in their pain.
Going back to Eric Kripke, we were talking about supernatural, like I mentioned, this is a thing for him. Like, he has a track record, and it's, you know, but almost 20 years later, in 2024, season 4 of The Boys came out, and there was a graphic scene where Huey Campbell, the main character of The Boys, is sexually assaulted by both a man and a woman. And the way that scene is played, I remember watching it and just, it was deeply uncomfortable, and you could tell that it was very much being played for laughs. But as an audience member who is cognizant of this type of thing, it was deeply uncomfortable for me. I'm not going to go into the gory details, how, but I will, yeah. But yeah, so that one involved both a male assailant and a female assailant. And it was never really addressed at all because, again, the intention wasn't to depict sexual assault. It was to depict something comedic. However, when I did go online to see what fans were saying, I was, a lot of people did call it out. A lot of fans saw and they called it out, including, male survivors, And what was interesting is that when Eric Kripke himself was questioned in an interview, he basically said something along the lines of, "Oh, well, that's a really dark way of looking at it. We thought it was hilarious." That was his response to being questioned, and I believe the interview outright referred to it as sexual assault. So, again, this is almost 20 years post, the the pilot episode of Supernatural, and him saying, "Oh, I wish that were me." Okay, so 2005, let's say this wasn't the public consciousness. 2024, what's the excuse now? Especially when the interviewer in question, was being serious in that question, and that was his response. What's the excuse now? And this is something that would actually carry over both in the rest of season 4, where he is assaulted again, this time in the form of his girlfriend Annie, being taken over by a shapeshifter, and therefore not herself, and he's completely unaware. So basically, he is being kissed by, he's having sex with what he thinks is his girlfriend, but isn't. What is essentially rape by proxy, and he is the one who is made into the bad guy in that scenario later on because he had sex with what he thought was his girlfriend and he didn't realize it wasn't her. So he's the one made out to be the bad guy for this, for betraying his girlfriend. So this sort of thing, carried over towards the end. And again, this was something that in the finale, like after the finale, people still said that, this whole season was this male character who was, very much, very Sam Winchester coded, let's say. His physical build is different, but again, he's positioned as the nerdy one, the effeminate one, the one who needs his girlfriend, haha, isn't that funny, to come and rescue him. He's a character who's not physically imposing, has no superpowers. He's meant to be a stand-in for the audience, even. Like, this was what was said. So if this is what you're doing to stand in for the audience, what are you doing? And again, this was completely brushed aside by the showrunner, the concerns that the fans had. I did not watch season 5 for a variety of reasons, and this was one of the reasons. So I'm not going to speak to that, but I would imagine that this probably was never addressed. So,
I yeah, but one thing I've never watched. I didn't watch The Boys. I tried watching it. It was too gory. I quit after like less than just a few minutes, I think. But I think that from what I read about that storyline, when his girlfriend made it about her insecurities, then about the fact that like basically he was sexually assaulted, like I think that showed the emotional immaturity of his girlfriend because she made his sexual assault about herself when it was like your your boyfriend was sexually assaulted and she's like, "Oh, you wanted someone." It was like something about how like the way that woman acted at the time was very much not how she acts because her whole arc or something that season was about her insecurities or something from what I understand. Was
yeah,
that
that
was
was
that correct?
basically it. And there
Yeah.
were so many ways, the Kripke and the other writers could have gone along with that. Like they could have done so many different things. Instead, in the very same season where they already had him assaulted and apparently thought it was hilarious, you know, they had this happen where they turned him into the bad guy. So, again, it's like, what are we doing here in 2024?
Yeah. So, like, speaking of that Yui storyline, the second, incident of sexual assault that Yui experiences in The Boys, I remember in the show Grimm, there was an incident like similar to that where the main character he is sexually assaulted, technically sexually assaulted, like what you said, like rape by proxy, by a witch who I, from what I remember, she made a potion that made her look like his partner and she sleeps with him and she gets pregnant. And that again is very normalized, very like folded into it. And I can't remember like how exactly it plays out in terms of his relationship with his partner at the time. But it's something that's very much glossed over. So like this isn't the first, I would say, depiction of like a shapeshifter, like, or someone taking the form of someone else and sexually assaulting a man. I would say like Wonder Woman 1984 has a similar questionable storyline because her lover's ghost possesses a man. and she sleeps with him, although he is possessed by her lover. And I believe that was written by a female. I would have to check. So again, like that is definitely a theme in Hollywood when it comes to like body switching or like, something like that.
What's up with that? Like, why? Why is that the thing you choose to do?
Here's the thing, right? Like I think the most important thing like to always remember about like these scenes or these storylines, because sometimes become like little plot lines, is that they're intentional. Like, those of us especially who like follow media, like we're into storytelling. Like we know how much goes into making a show or a movie, how many revisions, all the discussions from the start to the end. Like literally like what gets left in is very intentional. Like what gets put in and what gets left in at the end is very intentional. So these are choices. These are choices to put in these storylines and scenes. These are choices to leave them in. Any dialogue like rape jokes are chosen to stay in. Like these are very intentional choices. And that's why like I brought up accountability earlier. Like they're primed maybe, like they're primed to, be okay with these things. But as adults, they make intentional choices to leave these things and to put these things and leave them into the shows and movies. And so again, like the accountability has to be there. We're all accountable for what we do and what we say. And they're no different. Like storytellers in Hollywood are no different. So, like, speaking about the year 2024, like Cobra Kai dropped its season 6, two parts of it. So they dropped their season in like 3 different parts. And their part 2, I believe, dropped like later in the year compared to when The Boys season 4 came out. And in that part 2, there was an episode where a new character, Zara Malik, who's like a villain, she sexually assaults Robbie Keane. Objectively, it is sexually assault. It is played to be, he cheated on his girlfriend, which many fans said was not the case. So like he was really upset. He ended up taking like drinking for the first time. And literally there's a line right before that states that he doesn't drink. So it's being reminded to the audience, this is a character who doesn't drink and he's drinking for the first time, which means zero alcohol tolerance, right? And this other character, Quan, accosts him, who is another villain. And he's been like, kind of like riling Robbie up the whole time. And he tries to get Robbie to like react, and Robbie's just like kind of really out of it. And then he sits down, and then you see Zara like starting to approach him, and that's where they cut away. The next scene that follows shows them. He is coming out of her hotel room. He's fixing his hoodie. He's like saying he barely remembers what happened, and his head is pounding. So he's like out of it still. And she's just like, at least she can remember what happened. And then she kisses him, right? And he's so out of it. Like she's technically sexually assaulting him in that moment by kissing him, right? And then he just like walks away and he's still very much out of it. So, so many fans called out the scene. And it was really disappointing, very disappointing how the franchise like sticks to this notion of like, no, Robbie cheated on Tori. And, Robbie's character is the kind because of his childhood trauma and like, he very much is a self-blame character. And so he blames himself and he says, I made a mistake. Like later on when he's telling another character, he says, I got drunk, I made a mistake. And that's like a thread that unfortunately the showrunners and the writers of the episode carried through.
Right. And, you mentioned that they carried this through. I believe one of the showrunners did a Q&A in the immediate aftermath of that episode, or the part of that season where fans on Twitter asked him if they were ever going to address this, and he basically responded with saying that there was no assault. Robbie was drunk and depressed, and he just made a mistake. And then he commented that because you know he wasn't drugged, or or Zara Malik wasn't drugging him or tricking him or forcing him in any way, then that wasn't rape. Which again, it speaks to just how ignorant this man's idea of what sexual assault and rape look like. And again, this invalidation where you know you're asking fans, and then later on, I believe, was it 2 of the writers or 3 of the writers?
There were two women that wrote the episode. Yeah, and I would want to point out, like, when the episodes dropped, like, a lot of the female fans were like, "Oh, this wouldn't have happened if women wrote the episodes." And oh, it was two women who wrote the episode.
Well, it just goes to show how women can also be complicit in this type of thing, very much so against both men and women, and in this case, against a male. So women are very much complicit in this. And I believe in that interview, they made a point to say that they were leaving it up to the audience. However, if you go back to the Q&A, this is a showrunner, so if anybody would, know what happened, it would be the actual showrunner or one of the actual showrunners. And he very explicitly said that there was no assault. So then you have these two writers who were responsible for the episode. When they are asked, they hem and haw, and they kind of uh, evade responsibility by putting it on the fans. But then you do have the fans that were calling it out for being sexual assault. Okay, so which one is it? And then Netflix drops an Instagram reel, where Tori, the girlfriend that he supposedly cheated on, but which we know that wasn't the case, that, is the one who's victimized, as opposed to, the character in question that is, shown depicted as having been sexually assaulted.
Yeah, and Netflix drops that Instagram reel the day after the showrunner makes that really horrible tweet, because like there were sexual assault survivors who responded to his tweet. Like I don't remember ever seeing him respond to anyone who replied to him. But there were sexual assault survivors in there saying that the same thing happened to them, what happens to Robbie, and it was sexual assault. So it was like the message sent to everyone, especially males, is that if you're sexually assaulted while you're drunk, it's your fault and you're not sexually assaulted, which is, of course, not true. And not to mention women and the messages sent to women, about predatory behavior. Like, how you talked about early on about how there used to be that stereotype of, and really depicted, where when a man is predatory with a woman and she's playing hard to get, and that's like, no doesn't mean no, right? And but if you look at Hollywood and the way it depicts predatory females toward men, it's they have the same exact thing, where it's like no means yes. And it's very normalized for that. Now, in I think Robbie and Zara's case, Robbie had zero idea that Zara was already interested in, but like we as an audience and Tori knew, because the first line I believe Zara actually has is a comment about Robbie. So her interest was like from the start. And part of the dynamic between Zara and Tori is Robbie was something Zara wanted, and Tori had him. Like Zara raped Robbie to stick it to Tori, basically, and to get what she wanted, right?
Right. And, again, like going back to oh, we're going to leave it up to the fans. Well, the fans decided and they still never addressed it. So, which is it?
And in fact, in part 3, there is a line where Zara taunts Tori and says Robbie is a notch on her belt. So basically, a sexual assault victim is a notch on their assailant's belt. And going back to what you were saying about how like women are also complicit in, promoting sexual assault by writing these types of depictions. We were talking about Supernatural earlier, and one of the most notorious episodes of Sam being sexually assaulted was in season 7, when a woman was the showrunner at the time. And that was when that super fan Becky came back and made some love potion to make Sam fall in love with her. And I did just check, Wonder Woman 1984 was written by a woman and even directed by her. And in fact, this Cobra Kai episode that we've been talking about was not just written by women, it was directed by a woman too. So like women definitely take part in keeping society toxic. And I think, women like these who write these storylines and then, give these types of answers about them are 100% part of promoting rape culture in society. And they don't care. Like, it doesn't seem like they care at all about the implications of putting a storyline out like this out there. One of the things that like comes to mind that I always like to say is like abusers and enablers control the language around abuse and trauma. And when you have enablers like these showrunners and writers who, and even like the studios, like, taking Netflix and dropping that reel, when you have these enablers and they have these platforms and they use those platforms to promote rape culture, it is as a problem in society. And the act of sexual violation, it is the act of sexual assaults that they, continue to promote.
All right, so you had Cobra Kai, obviously, and you had The Boys. And in hindsight, it's very interesting that you had these depictions in the year 2024, and then also in 2024, Baby Reindeer dropped on Netflix, and that was pretty much the opposite of what we saw depicted in The Boys and in Cobra Kai, wherein you had a male victim, but the show dealt with it so completely differently. And basically, Baby Reindeer is, I guess we would call it an auto-fictional depiction of what the creator Richard Gadd went through with his experiences with being stalked and sexually assaulted by a woman, but also there's an undercurrent, like a sort of subplot, if you will, throughout the show, which also tackles with how prior to, him being stalked and sexually assaulted by a woman, he was sexually abused, groomed and sexually abused by an older male mentor. So, and the show kind of explores how all of these things, took place in his life and his experiences and coping with trauma and being a sexual abuse survivor, sexual assault survivor, survivor of stalking, his struggle with masculinity and sexuality in the wake of all of this. And one of the things that really struck me as I watched the show, and it's and this is why the show has stuck with me over 2 years later, is Richard Gadd really pulls no punches. you know to start with, he is playing his own self-insert character of Donnie Dunn. So basically, he is, you know, reenacting the abuse that he went through, on camera for all of us to watch. And again, he pulls absolutely no punches where he, really depicts, again, the self-insert character of Donnie, as pretty much antithesis of what we understand the perfect victim to be, the way he behaves, where certainly for his relationship, quote unquote, with the character of Martha, who plays a stalker, he does indulge her a lot of the times, and so there is that. And really, there's no easy answers with Baby Reindeer. I mean, we are very much, meant to understand that what happened was abuse, what happened was assault. We are meant to understand that. So, and we as an audience are left to grapple with our own biases and our own conceptions rather than, being given all the answers. And quite frankly, I do believe that, at least in part, the reason it went so viral was because it was depicting something that most of the audience had never seen before. We were watching a man be abused and assaulted, and it was done in a way that put his victimhood at center stage. Unlike the previous examples that we've given, whether that's Supernatural, whether that's Cobra Kai, whether that's The Boys, whatever. Baby Reindeer put the victim on center stage. It presented us with a man who is being abused, being assaulted, being stalked, is very much not the perfect victim, does a lot of things that, when you look at, are questionable at best and outright objectionable at worst, but he is very much the victim. And it's depicting real people. So the fact that you have a real life case of a man being, treated this way, I think a lot of people who watch just couldn't handle it. Because even aside from, again, like his behavior, just the fact that it was a man that we were seeing and the fact that this was a real life case. So there was none of that, veil of, oh, this is fictional happening. And a lot of people, they were stalking the real life people, trying to uncover who the real life Martha, which is the name of the female stalker character, trying to uncover who she was. And they did, and they were trying to uncover, the real life people involved. There was invasion into Richard Gadd's past, to the point where Richard Gadd himself had to put out an Instagram story with a statement asking them to stop, That was, and say that that's not the point of the show. I have a lot of respect for how he dealt with it. I remember even at the time, and certainly now, 2 years on, you know, and it did help a lot of people. I know that calls to um, the the charity that he's a part of, Survivors Manchester, uh, calls to that went up from both survivors of sexual assault and stalking, so male survivors. So calls went up you know, for there. So that's a very big thing. That's a real world example of the good that it did. I know that a lot of male survivors, spoke about how it made them feel seen. So it did do a lot of good, which is why it makes it doubly tragic to me. That people saw that, and rather than the people for whom this was a new thing, the people who hadn't been victimized in that way, for rather than taking this as an opportunity to learn and grow, because I feel like even as somebody who was cognizant of these things, I was cognizant of how men can be victimized and the concept that there is no perfect victim. I felt like I learned so much through watching Baby Reindeer and through, you know, particularly the male survivors and particularly the queer male survivors, because queerness is an undercurrent that runs through the show as well. Um, you know, like, like learning from them, from what they talked about and how the show had made them feel seen. I learned so much, so it was really shocking and really sad to me to see how so many people, they just didn't take that opportunity, and instead they turned their bad behavior around onto the creator, and they even started talking about how they felt more empathy for the abuser, more specifically the female abuser Martha. Like they felt more empathy for her. So that was really disturbing to me, and that stuck with me.
One other show I just wanted to mention was Bridgerton, and it's a show that's hailed for diversity, right? And it came out I think 2020, so a little bit a few years earlier than these 2024 shows or seasons or storylines that we talked about. And in that first season, a white wife rapes her black husband, and specifically calling out the races here because of this is a period drama. So at the time, especially the implications of something like that is something to take into context. But like for that storyline, he was he didn't want to have children because of his childhood trauma because of his father, and so he told her that he can't have kids, and she was very naive about sex and how conception worked and all that stuff. So she didn't understand like why, like when they would have sex, he would pull out. And then, when she learns about how conception happens, she tricks him, right? And she, they start to have sex. And then when he gets to that point when he's climaxing, she gets him into a position so he can't pull out. And she makes him, like she basically, sexually assaults him, she rapes him. And then, the way that was handled afterwards was, again, it was like it was not done in a way that should have been handled that way. And it was something that takes place in the book. So this is something they adapted from the book. And there's so many book adaptations of like shows and movies. And there's so many things that showrunners and filmmakers choose to change or just leave out completely. So you could leave this out, but instead they said they had a lot of conversations and they chose to leave it in. And like the showrunners' comments about it, like they knew it would be controversial from what I understood. And the showrunners' comments about it were like, we watch her grow into this woman who gets to shed all of the constraints society has held for her. Oh, no, has held her to. And she finally figures out who she really is and what she's capable of. And that article was an Entertainment Weekly article. It went on to say that the showrunner felt it was an essential part of who Daphne is. That was the character's name. And her struggles to define herself as a woman. And it's one of those things where a sexual assault of a male happened, and it's all about the female and what she experiences about the sexual assault.
This concept of defining herself, I find to be very strange wording on the showrunner's part. Why did that need to be how she defines herself? That's my question.
So that's the thing. I don't know if it's in the original book or not. But the point is that, yeah, like that's not how anyone should be defining themselves. And you know what really gets me? Like I talked about in terms of like predatory behavior, how why are we having like a role switching here? Why are women being predators to men fine, but men being predators to women, not fine. Like both are not fine. Make that clear. Both are not fine. But, why are we normalizing when women do this? Right. And at the end of the day, the whole point is normalizing the act of like spousal rape. Like, didn't have to force him, right, to do that. And I believe after that, it just became about him worrying she was going to get pregnant. So again, it's like instead of actually addressing the childhood trauma he has, it actually like is it doesn't even like it's more of a mockery of that.
Yeah, and there's an element of where this would have been an opportunity to explore that childhood trauma. This would have been an opportunity for a show like Bridgerton, which, yeah, it's a period drama, but it's a period drama that's like very modernized, let's be honest. From what I've seen, and I'll admit that I have not seen most of it, but it's clearly a show that, yeah, it's a period drama, but like I said, it's very modernized in just about every way. And they do, say that they tackle these issues and stuff. So why was this not an issue that they could have tackled, where, you had this male character that has like trauma and, doesn't want children. And rather than having that be a point of conversation, instead you have a scene that's depicting a rape, where you know, he's put in a position where, he doesn't get a say in whether or not, she's impregnated. So why does that have to be the case? So yeah, like it's messed up.
It's very messed up. And I think it's just like, it's another traumatic experience for him. Like, and the whole notion of like, her raping him and that like being a part of her understanding what she's capable of. So she's capable of being a rapist. Is that actually a good thing? Like, why is that framed in a good way? That's like really disturbing. And again, like, it's about her and her, like experience in the relationship versus what he went through, which is rape.
Yeah, absolutely. Bringing the topic of representation back, it really begs the question, what is being represented to us as the audience when we see scenes like what's happening in Bridgerton or Cobra Kai or The Boys or Superman or so many others that, we're probably not even thinking about right now. What's being represented to us? What are we as audience members being primed to accept? What's being normalized to us?
How can that ever be resolved? Like as a society, like there's so many layers to this, but it's like how can we ever reach a resolution if even a representation matters movement is unwilling to engage with this topic, but is instead using it to like talk about female empowerment or, just glossing or over it and just continuing like keeping that the status quo. We talk about combating stereotypes with the representation matters movement. So why aren't these stereotypes being combated?